Boston Gazette of October 4th, 1748, records that the Fitch family was escorted home from Canada by 5 French-Canadian gentlemen who brought with them Mr. John Fitch of Lunenburg, his wife, and 5 children who were captured the 3rd of July last. Louis N.M. Deschênes, Fitchburg's French-Canadian historian, once remarked, "It is interesting to contemplate what would have happened to Fitchburg if the 5 Frenchmen had overlooked bringing John Fitch back to his home. Surely the 5 Frenchmen deserve a monument commemorating their services. Today, happily, the westerly part of Lunenburg is Fitchburg, thanks to the return of John Fitch, and the 5 French gentlemen now have their memorial in Clegon." Fitchburg Franco-Americans form 2 very distinctive groups: the Acadian immigrants who came down from the maritime provinces of Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, and New Brunswick, and the French-Canadian immigrants from the province of Quebec. Although their French dialects differed, as did some of their customs, both groups emigrated south with a strong hope for a better life, and today they are simply known as Franco-Americans.
Still stands the forest primeval, but under the shade of its branches dwells another race with other customs and language. Only along the shore of the mournful and misty Atlantic linger a few Acadian peasants whose fathers from exile wandered back to their native land to die in its bosom. In the fisherman's cot, the wheel and the loom are still busy. Maidens still wear their Norman caps and their kirtles of homespun, and by the evening fire repeat Evangeline's story, while from its rocky caverns the deep-voiced neighboring ocean speaks, and in accents disconsolate answers the wail of the forest.
Train des dames avec l'opposé. Une demi-promenade, en rendant chacun chez vous. La main droite à votre partenaire, grande chaîne. Salut, en passant, en continuant sur le même chemin. Tout le monde balance et tout le monde danse, all swing. All promenez-vous 2 par 2. Au deuxième couple, la femme à droite et l'homme à gauche, 3 par 3, promenez-y. Chaîne des dames avec l'opposé. Une demi-promenade, en rentrant chacun chez vous. La main droite de votre partenaire, grande chaîne. Salut, en passant, en continuant sur le même chemin. Tout le monde balance.
The first Acadian Exodus in 1755 was brought about by a cruel and devastating deportation order issued by the British to be accepted. Many even returned to France. Longfellow, in his story of Evangeline, pictures this tragic time.
Friendless, homeless, hopeless, they wandered from city to city, from the cold lakes of the north to sultry southern savannas, from the bleak shores of the sea to the lands where the Father of waters seizes the hills in his hands and drags them down to the ocean. Friends they sought, and homes, and many, despairing, heartbroken, asked of the earth but a grave, and no longer a friend or a fireside.
More than a century later, many other Acadians left the maritime provinces of Canada, this time to seek a better standard of living by working in the mills and factories of New England. Although the Quebec French did not experience a forced deportation at the hands of the English, deep political issues and later economic problems contributed to the great emigration at the turn of the century. Between the time of the British takeover in 1763 and the 1930s, the population of French Canadians increased from 90,000 to 3 million. These prodigious birth rates, also known as the Revolt of the Cradle, La Revanche du Berceau, greatly contributed to the economic strain on the largely farm economy. Large families, often with 10 children or more, simply could not live on the limited land. Other non-farm opportunities simply did not exist. Conditions were ripe for immigration, particularly since the New England industries were booming and in search of cheap labor. The southward exodus to seek employment in New England's industries represented a major change in the way of life for the immigrants. Used to living on a farm, the strangeness of urban life was strong encouragement for French Canadians to hold on to their customs, their language, and above all, their religion. Factory work and the security it provided was a strong magnet for many immigrants. Used to earning $150 a year on the farm, if the weather was good, the immigrant and his family could now earn $750 per year, regardless of the weather. 12 hours per day of work, standing in front of a machine, seemed rather painless compared to their previous existence. From the beginning of the late 19th century immigration, Massachusetts was a haven for Canadian immigrants. In 1920, for instance, 35% of the total U.S. French-Canadian population resided in Massachusetts. Most were at work in the manufacturing industries and in the mills. Fitchburg was a typical New England industrial city at the time of this immigration and welcomed the cheap labor that the French-speaking Canadians offered. 1882 began the development of Claygon, where many of the city's French-Canadian immigrants would ultimately live and work. Andrew Pratt, who owned a large tract of land on the slopes of Rollstone Hill, sold part of this property to John Daniels, then secretary of the city's Board of Trade. Very much in favor of Andrew Claygon's plan to build a textile mill in the area, Daniels donated the land on which the factory was to be built. The Claygon mill was completed in 1885, and much of the required labor, 160 out of a workforce of 200, were French Canadians. As the firm expanded and merged with the Park Hill Manufacturing Company, intense recruitment by agents of the mill owners helped bring many more French Canadians to Fitchburg. By 1912, Park Hill was the largest concern in the city with nearly 1,400 employees. Once begun, Claygon grew rapidly from a cow pasture to a thriving city district with streets, factories, stores, a public and parochial school, and a Catholic church. By 1900, Claygon housed over 4,000 French Canadians. In addition to the recruiters sent up to Canada by the mill owners, Emigrants returning to Canada for visits with families were the strongest influence in providing a continuous flow of labor to the factories. These visitors, with their aura of material success and their stories of the unlimited opportunities, were often instrumental in bringing an entire parish of people back to the city. An important factor in the mill owners' preference for French Canadians was they usually had very large families, and that, in addition to adult labor, these families could provide even cheaper and more abundant child labor. Although life for first-generation immigrants was most difficult, the French-speaking residents of Fitchburg, through hard work, thrift, and dedication, soon raised 3 churches, 3 French-language parish schools, numerous businesses and professional offices, as well as many strong support organizations. In time, they also became a strong force in the political process. Without a doubt, the strongest institution to provide coherence and support the French Canadians in Fitchburg was the church. It was the mainstay of la survivance, the notion of protecting French culture against the inroads of outsiders. The first French parish was organized in Fitchburg in 1886 when Reverend Father Clovis Baudouin arrived. By June of 1895, the Immaculate Conception Church was completed, and the Sisters of the Holy Spirit took charge of the parochial school. However, this church still did not meet the needs of all the French-speaking people in Fitchburg. Its location, particularly, was very inconvenient for Claygon residents, who by this time numbered well over 200 families. As a result, Reverend Father Joseph Forrest arrived to help establish the new parish of St. Joseph. By 1900, the church was completed along with the parish school. A third French church was raised in South Fitchburg, the St. Francis of Assisi Parish. It too came into being because a large group of French Canadians were now living and working in South Fitchburg and needed their own church. This parish too built a school. The first pastor was the late beloved Reverend Father L.A. Langlois. The parochial schools associated with the churches were probably the most important institutions in the preservation of the French-Canadian identity. However, the early days of these parish schools were difficult. The Fitchburg School Board would not approve these schools because part of the curriculum was taught in French. After closing the Immaculate Conception School, the same fate seemed to await St. Joseph's School. The Reverend Father Charles Janot became pastor at St. Joseph's, and he decided to press the resistance to the school committee edict. After losing in the lower courts, the case of Commonwealth v.S. Frank Roberts was finally tried in the state Supreme Court, and the subsequent ruling in June of 1893 finally made it possible for the French parochial schools to exist. Beyond the parochial schools, there was a need for higher education. Assumption College, founded in 1904, provided a classical 8-year education to many French Canadians.
I'm proud of being from Claygon. I'm proud of the education I got at Assumption College, which gave me a beautiful background of French. It gave me a culture, not only the education, but in those days, the Assumptionist father gave us culture with our education. It was a total education.
Ethnic survival was also aided by numerous societies, as well as by a strong French-language newspaper, La Liberté, published in Fitchburg. The paper began publishing in 1908, and by 1937, La Liberté claimed a circulation of 7,120, one of the largest French newspapers in the country. A native Fitchburger, Josephat Benoit, served as its able editor until 1935, later to become mayor of Manchester, New Hampshire. A look at one of the rare copies from 1924, along with some photographs of the time, gives a great nostalgic glance back to the first generation French-American immigrants. Most societies in the French community were dedicated to preserving and furthering French-Canadian interests and social contacts. One of these, the Acadian Society of l'Assomption, was founded in Fitchburg with the initial participation and energy and inspiration of Elphère Léger. From its beginnings in 1902 until today, the Société l'Assomption has steadily grown and prospered, as have its thousands of members. It is now the very important and prestigious Assumption Mutual Life Insurance Company with $126 million of assets, and this is a strange contrast to its early humble beginnings of a few members meeting monthly in local councils to foster and encourage scholarships for the education of the children of its members. As a matter of fact, the narrator and his family have benefited from 3 such scholarships to both prep school, high school, and college. It is interesting to note that other French-Canadian organizations of importance included the Fraternal L'Union Saint-Jean-Baptiste d'Amérique and l'Association Canado-Américaine. Other organizations, such as Club Moreau, later to become the South Fitchburg Social Club, and of course the Garde d'Honneur St. Joseph. Organized in 1902 by a curate of St. Joseph's Church, the Garde provided splendid spectacle for many years. The Guy de Font-Galant Drum and Bugle Corps was also very well known. Both groups were important in the development of several professional musicians. Amongst these are 2 particularly: one, Paul Price, a teacher of music, and Gerard Gauguin, who played with the Boston Symphony Orchestra for 20 years. The bands were also a regular feature of Saint Jean-Baptiste Day's annual July parade. Political power still eluded the French community, in part because many French Canadians simply had not become citizens and could not vote. Along with various naturalization clubs, Frank P. Allen, a prominent Claygon businessman, probably helped and encouraged more French Canadians to become citizens than any other person in the community. The vote gave rise to politics. City Councilor Henry Dextraz reviews the rise of French Canadian political power.
Back with the first French mayor that we had, Mayor Carrier, at the time it seemed as if it was almost I shouldn't say a holy war, but an ethnic war. I remember, I was a young fellow at the time, that an article appeared on the Fitchburg Sentinel, and it was signed by the secretary of the nonpartisan party, and the ad went something along this line: as Fitchburg to become a second Quebec. Needless to say that the following day after the election, Mayor Cartier was elected mayor, and Fitchburg did not become a second Quebec, but it was the first time that the Franco-American ad established a foothold in politics. Possibly out of the 40,000 population the city of Fitchburg had, I'm sure that the Franco-American represent approximately 1/3 of the population. But because of the joie de vivre that the Franco-Americans have, they never got too interested in politics. Providing things were kept on an equilibrium, they were happy. But from the time of Mr. Duchesne, Mr. Cartier, Mr. Violette, Mr. Bastrash, Mr. Bellevaux, they suddenly realized that to get the things that were necessary for their own welfare, that they had to get in politics.
However, often more is required than the vote to gain political power and influence in a city. In order to give French Canadians the same opportunities as other ethnic groups, the Cable Club was established. Vic Carpenter Jr., whose father was one of the original founders of this group, now explains its purpose.
My father was one of the 12 people who founded the Cable Club of Fitchburg. It was founded in the mid-30s, roughly 1935. He was the first president of the club. The club was basically founded to help people of French origin obtain jobs in the private and public sector, to which they had been previously denied. They worked mostly underground, raising money for candidates, encouraging people of French origin to educate their children, sending them on to high school and college to further enhance their chances of better jobs. For example, the Cable Club, the members that started the Cable Club were the same people who started the American Conception Credit Union, such as the Workers' Credit Union started by the Finnish people, because of their inability to borrow money through the local banks in the 30s. They were dominated by other influences which didn't help the ethnic groups.
My name is Amy Denault. I'm a president of the Cable Club this year for the second time around. I was president back in 1972 as well. Our present-day club has changed in many respects from the days that it was founded, primarily because the discrimination is not as great as it used to be. However, once in a while we come up with a project where we'll find that there is still some discrimination. We've been able to clear it and take care of it, especially in the political jobs. We've had a lot of success in that area. We have sponsored things like the Boy State, which the American Legion sponsors, so we donate to them every year. We were very fortunate this last year to have a member of ours, Norman Bedard. His son, Tom, was elected to go to Boy State, and then elected by that group to go to Boys Nation, which is held in Washington, D.C. He's the first Franco-American descendant that we can find, in at least since the 1940s, that has been able to do this. That's quite an achievement.
Ultimately, a community is made up of people from all walks of life working at a variety of professions. The French Canadians have contributed their share of such individuals. Louis N.M. Duchesne, a consummate politician and historian of the French Canadians in Fitchburg. The Aubuchon family in the hardware business. The Pelletiers in building products. The Gelinas family in law. The soldiers and sailors who gave their lives in the nation's wars. Carmelita Landry and Joe Dauphiné in sports, along with great coaches like Bucky Richards and Clarence Amiot. The Touziant family in real estate and founder of the Northern Worcester County Board of Real Estate. Robert Cormier, internationally renowned author. Ralph W. LeMay, labor activist. The Isabel family, who owned restaurants, real estate, clothing stores, and funeral homes. The Dumont family members and Norman Babineau in the insurance business. Alfred Legier, 84 years old, almost retired, and a first-generation Franco-American. The spirit of the French Canadians continues in the descendants of the early immigrants. It is expressed in a pride of the French Canadian heritage, as well as in direct action of benefit to the community. Yvon Robichaud Jr., who lovingly restores broken down buildings in Clegon, talks about this ethnic pride.
I started working on my own buildings around 8 years ago, as soon as I turned old enough to own the first one. The rebuilding of property in the Clegon neighborhood, a lot of the things that happened because of a organization, the neighborhood center. It would be Zoel, who, along with a few of the other people, older people around, got the organization going. Then they formed a real estate committee, and that brought the redevelopment authority into the picture here in Clegon. They got this redevelopment funds to help rebuild it. The program really made its impact in the last year through the core area, the Main Street, up and down Daniel Street, Fairmont Street. All the real blight has been wiped out completely. There's a couple of buildings that still need some renovations, but the ones that weren't capable of being repaired or weren't feasible to repair because of land problems mostly. Not enough land around, too many people in the building, too close together to other ones that had deteriorated, they came down. Now it's a pretty decent and clean place to live. It's not as bad as it was. It's got room for improvement, but every place does. You know, everybody's got to have a place where they belong, and it's right here in Clegon. It's the only place.
Je te plumerai le dos, et le dos, et le dos, et la tête, alouette, alouette, gentille alouette, je te plumerai, alouette, gentille alouette, je te plumerai. Je te plumerai le bec, je te plumerai le bec, et le bec, et le dos, et le dos, et la tête, alouette, je te plumerai les ailes, je te plumerai les ailes, et les ailes, et les ailes, et les pattes, et la queue, et la queue, et le bec, et le dos, et le dos, et la tête, alouette.